Hello, my name is Alan Jones, with another in the series of videos exploring the life and works of Arlington's world-famous composer, Alan Hovhaness. Today we have the distinct honor of speaking with Maestro Gerard Schwarz, a renowned American conductor and trumpeter. Maestro Schwarz has profoundly impacted the music world, particularly by bringing more attention to mid-century American composers like Hovhaness, who had not received as much attention as they deserved. Maestro Schwarz, thank you very much for joining us today.
Alan, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Could you just start with a short introduction of yourself and your career? Hard to keep it short, but
I'll do my best.
An introduction.
Well, yes, I did begin my career as a trumpet player, and I was, just out of high school, I became a member of the American Brass Quintet, and then the American Symphony with Leopold Stokowski, eventually the New York Philharmonic. And then I ventured into conducting. I stopped playing when I was 30, and I had a number of music directorships: the New York Chamber Symphony, the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, Royal Liverpool Philharmonic, an association with the Tokyo Philharmonic in Japan, mostly Mozart Festival, the Waterloo. I mean, I did a lot of things, but mostly Seattle was my home for almost 30 years as music director of the Seattle Symphony. Now I do a TV series called the All-Star Orchestra, a wonderful series. And then I'm also the Distinguished Professor of Conducting at the University of Miami's Frost School of Music and music director of the Palm Beach Symphony. So that's pretty much a thumbnail of my career.
Is that TV series available to the public?
Yes, we've done I think 29 hour-long shows. They've been shown on public television all over the country. They have received 10 Emmy statues. And to get them, you'd have to just go on allstarorchestra.com or .org, allstarorchestra, one word, .org, and they're all there. Or you can go on YouTube and type in All-Star Orchestra Gerard Schwarz, and they're all there. So you can see them there. There are 26 with the All-Star Orchestra and 3 with the Marine Band. So they were also very interesting. A lot of American music and the music of Alan Hovhaness. I think we did Mysterious Mountain with the All-Stars. Or I'm not pretty sure. Anyway, but yes, we've done a lot of wonderful American music by living composers and by mid-century composers who are no longer with us, plus the standard repertoire with players from the great orchestras of the country, a mixture of people from Philadelphia and Boston and New York and Seattle and Los Angeles and so forth. It's very exciting. It's a TV series. They're not live concerts. They're television shows. And if you haven't seen them, I'm sure you'll enjoy them. They're very exciting.
As soon as I get home, I'm going to dive right into that. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
So,
Thank you.
My first exposure to Alan Hovhaness music was when I was in high school. And we had an excellent music director, and he had the band do Symphony No. 4. And I can tell you, it drove the kids wild, especially with the trombones and the chimes and things like that. And we got standing ovations from the audience. How were you introduced to Hovhaness music?
Well, first, let me ask you, where was that, Alan? Where did that take place?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Warren Mercer.
Yeah, great. It's a great music town. It was a great music town for music education.
Yeah.
Mine came similarly in high school. I did his Prayer of St. Gregory. I was a trumpet player, and I was always trying to do American music. As a trumpet player, this was back in the early 60s, you either played Baroque music, or a couple of concertos, Haydn and Hummel, or you played contemporary music. And so I became very active in playing music by all the great Americans that wrote trumpet pieces. Vincent Persichetti, The Hollow Man, The Quiet City of Aaron Copland, the Invocation of Robert Starr, The Prayer of St. Gregory of Alan Hovhaness. The Prayer of St. Gregory is a piece for trumpet and strings, or trumpet and string quartet. It's a gorgeous piece. And the reason why you did the Fourth Symphony with your wind ensemble, and the reason why I did the Prayer of St. Gregory, I think, was because the music is beautiful, accessible, in my case simple, in your case a little more experimental.
Yeah.
But it resonated with all of us, and we could play it. It wasn't that difficult, and it reached something in our souls and our hearts that he was able to talk about. Then I also did his brass quartet, something in fugue. I can't remember. You know, he was one of the great writers of fugue, and he wrote a wonderful brass quartet, and I did that as well, still in high school. So for me, these composers were like Beethoven and Brahms. I mean, I studied with Paul Creston for 3 years. I got to know all of the great American composers from that era, Alan, of course, and William Schumann, and my teachers, Vincent Persichetti, Milton Babbitt, Jacob Druckmann, Roger Sessions. I got to know Aaron Copland, Sam Barber. This was a great era of great American music. It's not to say that we don't still have one, but this time frame was extraordinary. And I was just so lucky to be in the middle of it and to get to know all these great composers. And Alan was among them. The next piece that I did of Alan was really quite something. It's called that's a trumpet piece for the wind ensemble. What you remember what it's called, Alan?
No, I know Eastman did a
It's
lot of
called Return and Rebuild the Desolate Places. It took me a second. Sorry about that. There was a band director in a high school in New Jersey, West Caldwell High School, a guy named Keith Bryan, who eventually became band director at Yale and then eventually went on to do other things. And he created a professional band in northern New Jersey. He called it something like the North Jersey Wind Ensemble, something like that. And he was a huge fan of Aaron Copland's music, of Alan Hovhaness' music. He also was a friend of a guy who ran Poseidon Recordings. I don't know if you remember that, but in the early days, there were a number of record companies that were very interested in Alan. Poseidon was one. Crystal in Portland, Oregon was one. Of course, eventually Delos, which was my company in those eventually, was very interested, as was Naxos. But initially it was Poseidon. And there was this remarkable CEO of that record label who was in love with Alan's music. And he was a friend of Keith Bryan. So Keith wanted to do a Hovhaness recording, which we did, a big brass piece, I remember, the Return and Rebuild the Desolate Places. And I was a trumpet soloist. I was 19, and it's a gorgeous piece. But like so much Hovhaness, it's that combination of, you know, this incredible aleatoric, wild explosion, and the places became desolate. And then the trumpet comes in with this gorgeous melody, and it was the rebuilding of the desolate places. So, as in the case of the Fourth Symphony, it was full of imaginative, unusual things, but in the end, it became gestures of melody and harmony and beauty. So that was my first experience. I met him at the time. Okay. He was living on, and I, you know, it's a long time ago, so some of these facts not be 100% accurate, but I think he was living on 52nd Street and Broadway in a hotel there. There was a brass shop called Giardinelli's, which was the best brass shop in New York at the time. We brass players used to go there and try instruments and hang out and get mouthpieces made and all kinds of things. And Hovhaness lived above it in the hotel, and that's when I first got to meet him. It was interesting because that would have been about 1966. And so then I knew Alan until he died. He was always the same. I mean, I'm sure he wasn't the same for his wives and for that, but for me, he was always the same. Humble, soft-spoken, thoughtful, sensitive, and you know, quite. It was a great honor. This 19-year-old kid getting to know Alan Hovhaness, as it was with some of the other great Americans that I got to know at the time.
Did he sort of attract young musicians to work with him? And
Absolutely. We were all enamored of him because, when you think about living composers and the music that they write, there was a time in that era, in the 60s, into the 70s, where so much of the music being written was so difficult to hear, difficult to play. And we just loved playing our instruments, whether you were playing what was your instrument, Alan?
Guitar. Well, I played timpani, clarinet, and ended up on guitar.
So, you're playing the clarinet, let's use that.
Yeah.
And, you're attracted to the quality of the sound, to the woodiness, to the beauty, to the range, to the dynamic range, to the expressive possibilities. Well, we're all that way in our respective instruments. So as a trumpet player, I just love to make it sound beautiful. I love to play melodies. And Alan did that for me, and he did it for the clarinet, and he did it for the oboe, and he did it for the bassoon, and he did it for everybody. And we all just loved playing his music. And it was interesting is when you look at, I'll tell an interesting story. When we recorded the Mysterious Mountain, it was either that or the Prelude and Quadruple Fugue. I don't remember which one we did now. I should have researched it before. But anyway, when we did it with the All-Stars, of course, the orchestra is made up of, as I mentioned, great musicians from Boston and Philadelphia and New York and Cleveland and so forth. And about 10 of them came to me and said how much they loved the piece and how they had never played a piece of his before. They'd never even heard of him. How come they don't know Alan Hovhaness? Now, this is probably 6 years ago. And the reason is, of course, we know, let's assume it was Mysterious Mountain. We know that it was commissioned by Stokowski. We know it was premiered in Houston. We know that Fritz Reiner recorded it. But that was in the 50s. After that, when you look at the history of the performances of Mysterious Mountain, which I've done, from the publisher, because it's a rental item, you can see who played it. It was mostly played by universities, all state orchestras, all things like that. Yeah. Very rarely played by professional ensembles. I just have no idea why, because the music is fantastic. And these players came to me and said, how come, and let's say it was Philadelphia, we haven't done a piece of his, I know Ormandy did, but that was a lot of years ago. One's never sure about what goes on. Think about a composer like William Schumann, one of my favorites, like Alan is, and he was a friend. I recorded all of his symphonies. I love his music. He was, at one time, the president of Juilliard. At one time, he was the chairman of Lincoln Center. And look at the programming at Lincoln Center. See how many times you see a William Schumann piece being played. Look at the programming at Juilliard. See how many times William Schumann's being played. Here was a composer, a great composer, in my opinion, who's not played in the city and in the institutions that he helped create. Right. I mean, he was the second president of Lincoln Center, or chairman, whatever he was called. He created the Film Society. He created the Chamber Music Society. I mean, he did so much for the city of New York, and they don't play his music. And it's not because it's not wonderful. And so with Alan, it's not dissimilar. I mean, all of those composers, Peter Menon is the same. He was a president. I did a piece of his in Miami last year, Moby Dick. It's his most famous piece, a great piece. And a distinguished member of the composition faculty wanted to know what the piece was. He heard me rehearsing it. I told him, and then he said to me, "Who's Peter Menon?" It's shocking in a way, and a little depressing in a way, but that whole era have been lost. Now, what's happened? Florence Price came on the scene. Florence Price was a member of that 1950s, 1940s, 50s, 60 group. And her pieces are fine. They're played all the time. They've been recorded at Philadelphia, and it's big success. You'd think it would trickle down to the other great composers, and maybe even greater composers living at the time. No, has not happened. So these great Americans, Alan Hovhaness included, are not played much by professionals. His music, though, is played a lot by universities and I play his pieces. Next year, I'm doing a piece of his with the Palm Beach Symphony. I'm doing a piece of his with the Frost Orchestra. I do music of his all the time. I love it. I believe in it. I believe in him. And that's what it takes. It takes conductors to champion a composer. So when people complain about not enough American conductors conducting the major orchestras, blah, 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 it's not about their ability. It's about the repertoire that they know. So I know American repertoire a lot better than many of my European colleagues. Leonard Slacken does, and Dennis Davies does, and all our wonderful conductors.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with not having enough Americans at the helm of the major orchestras. It's not because of talent. It's not because that. It's just a question of knowing the repertoire. So Hovhaness, and I think there's a resurgence now of interest in him, partly because of you. Hinako, his widow, who, as we know, died a few years ago, did a huge amount to promote his music, did everything she could. While he was alive and after he died. She just invested. Like, I remember once she called me on the phone, I want to record a guitar concerto, and we did it in Berlin. I mean, it was to have a champion like that was great, but to have conductors do it is crucially important. And so I'm happy to be one of them. Dennis Davies was the other major one, and Dennis, though he made his career in Europe, he doesn't conduct in the United States much. He's in Poland, he's in Austria, he's in Germany, and so forth. So I don't know if he's doing a lot of music of Hovhaness there, but he's not here, so I just don't know what he's up to.
Right. Yeah, I don't mean to be critical, but I think sometimes the BSO and Pittsburgh Symphony and whatever, they spend all their time playing the old chestnuts. And sometimes I wonder if it's because the old ladies who write the checks like to hear all of Beethoven's symphonies. But
It could be, but they're also playing a lot of new pieces. They're playing a lot of premieres, and maybe they need to look at a little bit of our history as well. So if you do a lot of new stuff, if it's great, okay, I'm all in favor of new, but there has to be a balance too. In the jazz world, where they don't have such a broad repertoire, it doesn't go back hundreds of years, it goes back 100 years, or 150 years or whatever. They play all of the old timers. They play, Jelly Roll Morton and Bix Beiderbecke, and they play, Count Basie and Duke Ellington, and they play everybody.
Yeah.
Of course, their history is a lot shorter than ours,
yeah.
and they play Dixieland. Now, we don't do all of it, but there is a wealth of great American music from the latter part of the 19th century until, let's say, 1980, that's almost never played. What if, I did a cello concerto of Arthur Foote with my son in Buffalo last year. When have you heard a piece of Arthur Foote on a concert? Now, Kusevitsky did it all the time. You look at Kusevitsky's programs, he was doing all, including Hovhaness, he really was extraordinary. But he was, compared to what goes on now, it's all a shame and it's lost. And I've tried, and I keep pushing, and all I can do is program those pieces, which I do.
Well, we'll try to do our little piece. So you've answered one of my questions of whether you had met Hovhaness before you moved to Seattle, but I don't know if he helped you decide to go to Seattle, or was an independent.
I wish I could say yes, but no. I went to Seattle in the mid-'80s, 84, and I went because, I was music director of the New York Chamber Symphony and Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, and I had 2 summer festivals, mostly in Mozart at Waterloo. I was looking for a large orchestra to conduct. That was my next step in my career. And then I was offered 3 or 4 at the time, and I thought that Seattle had the most potential. They were all good, but Seattle was the one I thought, this could be something. And of course, in 1984, the city didn't have Amazon, and Microsoft was just starting, and Starbucks was just starting. All the great companies weren't there yet. It was not a wealthy community, and they were not they had a ballet, opera, and symphony, but there was only one hall for all three, and it wasn't very good acoustic. There were a lot of issues,
Yeah.
but the quality of the orchestra, the potential was there. And so I, of course, took that one. I remember my manager at the time said, "Whatever you do with all these offers you get, don't go to Seattle. That's going to be a disaster." I decided to change managers.
Well, I've read that you and Alan essentially saved the Seattle Symphony, and that the subscription numbers went from thousands to tens of thousands. If what I read was accurate.
That's true. And what's interesting about our relationship with Seattle is that he was part of my repertoire, our repertoire, from the moment I arrived. Of course, I knew that he was there, living a little bit in suburban with a beautiful, not far from the airport, the beautiful view of Mount Rainier. And as soon as I arrived, loving his music and knowing him, but it was more loving his music than knowing him, loving his music. Every year I would program something.
Right.
And, but I remember one year, it was an incredible story. We were doing his Symphony Number 50, the Mount St. Helens Symphony. This is a big piece. It's 45 minutes at least. You're doing a big symphony by Brahms or the Eroica. Yeah, fine. You do a big symphony by Hovhaness. That means your major piece on that program is going to be the Mount St. Helens Symphony. It's a gamble. It's a risk. That kind of risk I liked to take because I believed in the music, and I knew if the audience loved it, great, but it wouldn't be offensive. And then Mount St. Helens was in our backyard in Seattle. I mean,
Right.
It had a good name. It's not dissimilar from the story of Stokowski getting Alan to call his Symphony Number 3 Mysterious Mountain. As you know, he wasn't intending to call it Mysterious. He didn't want to call it anything.
I do not know that. That sounds like there's a story there.
Oh, it's a great story because Stokowski was a real showman.
Yeah.
And when Alan wrote his piece and he loved it and he said, "What's it called?" And Alan said, "Symphony Number 3. Stokowski said, "What? It's got to have a name." Now, think about it. What Haydn symphonies do you know? You know the Philosopher and the Clock and the Drum Roll and the Surprise and the Miracle. You know all of the named symphonies of the 104. And there are probably 90 that are not named that you don't know, which are equally great. So Stokowski was smart. And the story goes that Alan said, "I don't have any idea of a name for this." He said, "Well, what do you like? Tell me, what do you like?" He said, "Well, I like mountains." He said, "Oh, good. Mountains, good. Let's do that. Let's call it Mysterious Mountain." It's not dissimilar from Aaron Copland writing Appalachian Spring.
Right.
His title was Ballet for Martha. He had no idea that had anything to do with Appalachia or the Appalachian Trail. He had no idea, and everyone said, "Oh, he's really embraced Appalachia and Ballet for Martha." He didn't find out till after when William Schumann wrote this great ballet he did for Martha Graham called Judith, very dramatic piece. Same thing. He had no idea it was about Judith. Martha Graham would give them the bar numbers. You do 30 bars at this speed of dramatic music, and then blah blah blah. And as you know, Alan Hovhaness wrote music for Martha Graham. The same idea. And in fact, the other composer, so this is a little bit of a tangent now, but I worked a lot in my early days with a composer or the choreographer named Eric Hawkins, who was married to a composer named Lucia Dlugoszewski. Nobody knew they were married. I did, but most people didn't. And what most people didn't know is Eric Hawkins was married to Martha Graham. Eric Hawkins was very handsome, brilliant. He went to Harvard as a teenager. I think he was 16 or 15 when he first went there. And again, the story is that she thought they would make beautiful children. They probably would have, but whatever reason they couldn't. She couldn't conceive, or whatever. There was, and they didn't have in vitro in those days. So Martha Graham divorced Eric. But Martha Graham was committed to live music. She was committed to commissioning new pieces. and she commissioned some by the greatest American composers. Eric did the same. He maybe went one step better because he had his own composer, Lucian Drugachevsky, just the way Merce Cunningham had John Cage. Merce Cunningham was also a member of the Graham Company at the time. All the great American modern dancers of that period, Pearl Lang and everyone else, came from that house that Martha Graham built, and they were all committed to live American music. And Eric, of course, he had his in-house composer, but he loved Alan Hovhaness. He loved him from when he wrote for Martha Graham, and he commissioned a number of pieces that Alan wrote for him. So it was our lives interacted many times. And then, of course, the years in Seattle, which we were talking about, were thrilling because we would do, so I'll finish the Mount St. Helens Symphony story. So we're doing this symphony, and I'm nervous. I'm always nervous for programs that are a little unusual and are pushing the audience. We got an ovation for that as if we had just done the Beethoven Ninth. It was phenomenal. People went wild. I mean, I don't mean a few, I mean everybody. They stood up, when that great moment where the volcano erupts, it's just second to none. And wow, it was really something. And the audience went wild. And from then on, I could do everything of Alan's, and everybody was happy because they knew what to expect and they loved it.
And again, you've anticipated one of my other questions, which was, is there any particular Hovhaness piece that you think the audiences went crazy over? And I think you've answered that. I don't think any others.
That's the one. But you mentioned the Fourth Symphony. I remember after Alan died, it was the 100th anniversary of his birth, and I wanted to do an Alan Hovhaness week, a week of his music. Now, when you do something, I go to the management and I say, I'd like to dedicate, I have 4 concerts a week. Usually we do 1 program. But in this case, I want to do at least 2, if not 3 or 4, and I want to do only Hovhaness music. So, managers, they get nervous. They say, oh, you can't do that, no one will come, and blah, blah, blah. And, and I said, no, we've done so much of his music. They will come because they embraced it. I couldn't convince, someone you could insist. That's not how I live my life. I'm a team player, and they really didn't want it. And I said, okay, let's think of another thing. How would it be if we did, our regular soloists on the second half, and the first half of 4 concerts do 4 different halves of Alan Hovhaness's music? They bought that. So, Lynn Harrell played the Elgar Concerto, and John Lill played the Brahms, whatever they played. And in the first half, we did that now. So think of this now. I have 4 rehearsals, 4 concerts, 4 pieces, concertos, and 4, how am I going to rehearse all of that? So I thought to myself, well, how would it be if I got the University of Washington Wind Ensemble, the band, the Wind Ensemble, to play 4 of his wind symphonies, including the 4th. I forgot which numbers, 4, 7, whatever they were. And that would cover half the program, and then I could do orchestral stuff for the other half, and I'd be able to have time to rehearse everything. And that's what we did. So we had a collaboration with the University of Washington, which of course had a long history with Alan as well, even though when I was there, they didn't. But prior to my being there, he was involved there. And the Wind Ensemble came, and they played on the stage with the symphony, separately, but with the symphony. And we had a week of Alan Hovhaness celebration. That was a huge success, just huge. It just shows you that the audiences are discriminating. If they like it, they stay. As people say, if they don't like it, they vote with their feet.
Right. I think people underestimate the audiences. I remember at the high school thing, after hearing all the Sousa and the show tunes, and then Symphony No. 4 came on, they were standing before it was over. Yeah, it was.
I agree. People underestimate, and the audience is much more sophisticated than they even think they are.
Yeah.
So how many people come to me and say, "Oh, I don't know anything, but I thought that concert was fabulous." The answer to that is, you know a lot. you'd be shocked at how much you know. And, and so for me,
And how much you feel.
yeah, that's right.
I don't think, with Hovhaness music, in some ways, technically, it's not that complicated or challenging, but it hits you at a different level. You're not looking for the virtuoso performances. It hits you in the gut. And I think that's what the audiences appreciate.
But the other thing that I mentioned earlier, as you know so well, Alan, that he was one of the great writers of fugue. Yep. Now, and during this period in American musical history, now we're talking 50s, 60s mostly, those composers, the ones we talk about, like Creston and Schumann and Hovhaness and Menon and so forth, they were phenomenally educated contrapuntally. Mm-hmm. I remember Creston telling me once that Ormandy called him and said, "Paul, I want you to write me a new piece for the Philadelphia Orchestra, but no fugato," because we as Americans were so into the fugue. And come on, so was Bach and so was Beethoven. I mean, it's not so bad. But Hovhaness once said to me how he writes quadruple fugues. He does all this incredible stuff with the fugue. And he was a little offended that when people studied fugue in school, they never studied his fugues. And when I was studying fugue at Juilliard, we studied 16th century and 18th century fugue. We didn't study 20th century fugue.
Stop there.
Well, that was it. I mean, you had to know about the Renaissance fugues and you had to know about Baroque fugues. Isn't that a shame? Anyway, Alan was, he said, but not only that, think of it. When you study, and I'm not sure now, but certainly as recently as 10 years ago, if you have a music appreciation course in a regular college, not a conservatory now, I'm not talking, or a music school, just a regular college, a regular university, and you study it, you have an arts requirement, and so you take a year as a survey of classical music. So they start with Gregorian chant. Right. Quite frankly, there's not a lot of people who like Gregorian chant. I mean, it's not the most scintillating music in the world. I apologize for those people who love medieval music. But as you move forward, Renaissance, and Baroque, and then classical, and then Roman, it gets better and better and better, in my opinion, or equally good, let's say. Yeah. But when you get to the 20th century, I remember a young man who I knew from Seattle who was at Columbia, and he took one of those courses, and he said to me, I hate medieval music. And I loved it. And then it got to the 20th, I really hate 20th century music. I said, you do? Oh yeah, just terrible. I said, what did you study? Well, we studied Boulez, and we studied Varese, and we studied Morton Feldman, and we studied John Cage, and we studied Xenakis, and we studied Malipi. I mean, I forgot all of them, but they didn't study Hovhaness or Copland, or Bill Schumann. They were studying the cutting edge of let's call it avant-garde, the internationalists, and the kid didn't like any of it. Well, I understand that. I can't blame him. But isn't it interesting that what they did, then at the very end of the semester, they had one little chapter about Americans, and they talked about Gershwin and Copland and Bernstein and Barber. I mean, they're wonderful composers, don't get me wrong. I love them. But we have a lot more than that. Yeah. And Alan is one of the stars that I feel like his let's call it the sun. His sun is rising all the time, and people are starting to appreciate his music more and more. For a while, even from the Tanglewood days when he was studying, it was a little too simple for some people, too melodic, too beautiful. Well, we don't care anymore, do we? Right. I mean, the fact when you start thinking about Sibelius Symphony. Sibelius is writing his last symphony, in 1928 or 29? By then, Stravinsky wrote The Rite of Spring already. Right. I mean, talk about conventional writing. Think about Richard Strauss writing The Metamorphose in 1940, whatever it was, 44, 45. We don't care what year it was written, do we? We don't say, The Metamorphose, it's so traditional. And it was written in all the great experiments were going on then. Nobody says that. They just want to listen to the music. Yeah. And I think what's happened, there's been enough time since Alan has died that the actual year doesn't matter. What matters is the quality. And he wrote. There was one other problem with Alan's music. He wrote so much. You think that's wonderful. Well, if you write 4 symphonies like Brahms did, or Schumann did, it's easy. You learn 4 symphonies. Piece of cake. If you write 9, okay, Mahler, Bruckner, Beethoven, 9, still easy. You write, how many did he write? 77 or 79? I can't even count how Alan, just a lot of symphonies.
Yeah. I think it's
it's very hard to keep track of them. Yeah. So it's the same thing. It's what Stokowski said. You give them names. The Exile Symphony, the Mysterious Mountain. You give them names, and they do better. Yeah. You give them numbers up to 9. When you get you can get away with 10 or 11, like Bill Schumann or David Diamond wrote 11. But Shostakovich wrote 15. It's pretty good, but more than that, rough going. So anyway.
So it was probably in Seattle. I've seen photos of you and Alan, and I think your children. Did you have a personal relationship in Seattle?
To a point. I loved him. He loved the kids. He loved my wife, Jody. We loved Hinako, and we were close. But he was, it seemed to me anyway, he really kept to himself much more than I did in those days. I was more gregarious, I was more outgoing, and I was a musical personality in the community. He was a composer. He sat in his room and he wrote music. And then he'd come up for air once in a while, and we would see him. And I wouldn't say, like, for example, David Diamond, we were very close to, and David used to stay with us in Seattle, and he was like part of the family. Alan was a little more introspective and to himself. David loved Alan's music, thought the world of it. And remember, a lot of those composers, even Bernstein in those days in the 40s, didn't really give him as much respect as he deserved. Right. But David did, and David believed in him. And I saw them together, and they were extremely friendly. And of course, composers like Lou Harrison and people like that loved Alan. We had actually a closer relationship to Hinako because, of course, she's very charming, but also at a time when Alan was dying, I intervened and at her request, and basically we kept him alive for another 5 years, I think. It was, not we. I recommended the doctors, and I talked to the doctors and we got a whole team together. He was in a wheelchair. He had a little bit of Alzheimer's, but he was alive, and she was happy.
Was he still writing?
Sorry?
Was he still writing near the end?
Yes. And she kept finding music, and she would call me and go, "Oh, Jerry, I found another symphony in the basement. I want you to record this, and we found another guitar concerto." She was incredible, and he was always just immersed in his great art.
I ran across this little video of he and Hinako went into a little bakery or coffee shop, and they went over and they picked out some pastries, sat down at the table. Alan pulls out a score in his pen and he's writing while he's eating the pastry. Like you said, he couldn't stop him.
Absolutely, and he had that great facility. And what's interesting is that, all of the music has those extra musical influences, whether it's music of Bali, or music of Japan, or music of China, or music of the Philippines, or of course Armenian music. He was
Komitas.
He was a real, born in Massachusetts and blah blah blah, but he really felt his heritage, and he had a great spiritual side, and was greatly influenced by Tibetan music and. Some of the great pieces, he was even influenced by whales and the whale song.
Right.
And
going the other direction of his influence on other composers, I've heard that he, for example, was sort of channeling Komitas through Hovhaness to Philip Glass, And
Yes.
some of his experiments with instruments maybe influenced John Cage. What do you think his influence has been?
Well, among those composers, whether it's Lou Harris and John Cage and Philip Glass and Terry Riley and Steve Reich and so forth, it was very, very strong, because it communicated to them. I think now he's having a greater influence on the more mainstream composers. So those composers were, they were called minimalists. They were John Cage was an improviser, as we know, but now his influence, I think, is deeply felt by most Americans writing. I mean, if you would ask Jennifer Higdon or Theo Fanidis or even Aaron Kerners or people like that, they would probably tell you that his music has been influential to getting them to maybe be a little simpler. We got so complex. It was so hard to play the music. It was so hard to hear. The audiences didn't respond. And so we go in these different waves, and composers then start to realize that the audience does matter. And someone says, "Oh, just wait." The Schoenberg 5 pieces were written in 1903. They're still not repertoire items. They're still not pieces that the audience embraces. I love them, but I don't program it because I know the audience hates it. But Alan, on the other hand, the audience loves, and we go in waves. And the wave now, I think, is we care about the audience. Thank goodness. But there were times where they didn't care about the audience. Milton Babbitt, who was a dear friend and a teacher of mine, certainly wasn't worried about whether the audience was going to be able to appreciate his music. No. Alan cared about the people, cared about us, cared about the audience, as I do. And I think his influence is greater now than it's ever been.
Yeah, as you said, I think some musicians and the audience, they listen to modern music and they can't get anything out of it. There was a time in the 60s and 70s where melody and rhythm were no, you couldn't have any of that anymore. And he sort of showed you get a very adventurous, innovative music, but have a melody, have something you can hum and something you can tap your foot to.
And he wrote about that. He wrote and he said that the music, without any of the basic elements that make music great, form, melody, harmony, without those, it's not to say you can't have the aleatoric sections and the senza mazurka stuff.
Which he did.
Which he did.
He showed he can do it.
It was purposeful.
Right.
It wasn't a whole piece.
Exactly.
He never wrote an aleatoric piece. And he always embraced the fundamentals of great music. And he said, he didn't pull any punches. He said, "Oh, the music just it will never survive. It's not what music's about. Music is about nature. It's about having a tonal center. It's about being recognizable. It's about leaving a concert and actually having been touched by something." And he talked about it, and he never changed. Stravinsky changed, right? Stravinsky wrote the great ballets, then he wrote the great neoclassic music. Then after Agon, he wrote serial music, and that music's almost never played.
Right.
But he kept writing. It's easy to write serial music. It's much harder. I remember talking to Aaron Copland, asking him to write a trumpet concerto when I was still a trumpet player. And he said, "Jerry, don't you know I stopped writing?" He did. In 1990, whatever, he stopped because he had said it. He couldn't do it anymore. But Stravinsky took a different direction. He started writing. Could he have written serial music? He could have. He did write a couple of pieces, and they weren't so successful, but they were still pretty good. Alan stayed true to himself. He didn't let the outside influences get to him. Remember, there was a time in the 70s and 80s, if you weren't a serial composer, you couldn't get a job teaching at a university. Of course, Alan never taught at a university. Did he? I don't think he ever did. But you couldn't get a job my teacher, Paul Creston, couldn't get a job teaching. And he got one eventually in Bellingham, Washington. But he was always true to his ideals of music and melody, harmony, and blah blah blah, as Hovhaness was. And the ones that really went with the flow of what the flavor of the month was have really fallen by the wayside, I think.
And it's interesting. You bring up Stravinsky. If you mention Stravinsky to people, they think of the Firebird, and they think of the Rite of Spring. And so, in some ways, I'm wondering if the fact that Hovhaness didn't have a big hit, that sort of liberated him. So there's, if anything, he wrote a lot, but it seems like there's more of his repertoire being appreciated instead of like the 3 big hits.
You're absolutely right. But the other thing that is, I think, interesting, as you were saying that. So Stravinsky wrote those great ballets, and before that, the Fireworks and the Scherzo Fantastico, wonderful pieces, delightful, charming. And then he went in a new direction. And then he went in another new direction, and yet another new direction. I mean, Alan, in his way, did that too, but he did it with the cultural influences of different countries, influences of different cultures, influences that, maybe he started to use more bells and more mallet instruments. I mean, just the influences, but he kept true to his style, which is really interesting if you think about it. Even though the Japanese wood prince xylophone piece is clearly influenced by Japanese traditional music. It sounds like Alan Hovhaness.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So his influences and his changes had to do with different cultures more than had to do with a different style of writing, where he would embrace serialism or embrace other kinds of aleatoric styles. Really interesting.
And I think that international influence may be related to how his music's being sort of rediscovered. I think even back in the 60s and 70s, there wasn't such a big world music scene where you didn't hear gamelan, you didn't hear Shinto chime. Where probably in the early part of this century, world music became big and fusion, and everybody started bringing in international influences. And now I think people are looking back at Hovhaness and saying, oh, now I get it. It doesn't sound so alien anymore.
You're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. I remember doing a festival once about the influence on American composers music, and mostly from China and Vietnam and Thailand and so forth. And it's true. You could really see a whole group of Americans who were influenced by world music. Yeah. And of course, Alan was the grandfather to that.
He invented fusion, I think.
And he loved it, and he embraced it. It's quite something. Yeah. And he embraced it spiritually too. He was a very spiritual guy. He was a real philosopher about what he considered important in the arts.
When he wasn't composing, do you know what he did? Would he just go out and watch the sky, or go fishing, or go to baseball games?
He did not baseball that I'm aware of. It could have been, but I'm not. What I'm aware of, watching the sky. Yes, he was a big lover of nature. I mean, I guess one of the things that he has in common with John Cage, John Cage was a big mushroom expert, and John Cage searched out mushrooms, and he knew all the different kinds of mushrooms. Alan just loved mountains. He loved Mount Rainier. His home was on a mountain, a small mountain, but on a mountain where you could look around and see vistas everywhere. On the other hand, you remember, as I said, when I met him, he lived on 52nd Street and Broadway. I mean, there were no mountains there.
Right.
But that's what he embraced, and that's what he loved. He had to spend his time. Now, he didn't do what most composers did. He didn't become a teacher. He was able to make a living as a composer. And that comes a lot from C.F. Peters, his publisher, and after that, of course, Hanako, her own publishing company, and then a few other pieces by Schirmer and so forth. But the pieces were being played, and sheet music was being sold, and he was getting commissions. I mean, he was one of those. I mean, Copland was also one who could make a living by composing. Now, Alan certainly didn't make the kind of money that Copeland made, but it's really nice. When you think about that, we performers do much better than composers. So I always advise my composer friends who can play, write yourself a concerto.
Right.
Shostakovich tried to do that with his piano concerto, the second piano he wrote for his son. But I mean, you try, because then you can get the fee for playing as well as for composing.
Now, when you were at Seattle, if you were, say, rehearsing a Hovhaness piece, say Mysterious Mountain, would he come to the rehearsals, and did he interact in how you would produce his music?
Not
or he
much.
He just throw it over the fence and say, play it?
Yeah, he respected us enough. He had the attitude that I believe in, by the way. You write a piece, and it's no longer yours. Now, it's somebody else's. It could be mine. Now it's my piece. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make my interpretation. He was always very generous and very wonderful. Also, I was involved with him a number of times when he was recording, conducting. Mm-hmm. And he was a very elegant, lyrical conductor. He wasn't a very demonstrative conductor. He was sweet and wonderful. And I remember doing, I was a symphony, I think, where Hanako was a soprano, and he was very protective of her. We had a producer who would criticize her diction here or there, and he would go crazy, and if he was unhappy with he changed the damn word before criticizing his wife. I mean, that's absolutely true. Yeah. It's really quite amazing how we did a number of recordings in Seattle where he was the conductor, and I was, in a sense, not helping him, but helping produce and being part of it. But it was his, and he did it very well.
Was he particular in the studio, or was it one take and everybody go home?
Well, it was particular in terms of the expression. It wasn't particular in terms of the ensemble or this or that, but the feeling for the way you wanted it to go. Now, and I think he appreciated this in me, I was a big interpreter of his music. So in other words, he'd give a piece, I'd shape it. Very often, he left it to us, to me or whomever, to make that beautiful phrase, to the obvious things. But he, what was interesting, in Mozart's time, Mozart didn't write any of that in. He left it to the performer. But by the time he got to Mahler, everything was written in. I mean, it didn't leave much. There wasn't much left to anyone's imagination. That's not true, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Hovhaness was more like Mozart. He wrote the notes, and he expected us to interpret those and to make them come to be special. And I remember when I was recording an album of his at the Eastern Music Festival, and of course in Seattle, and for that matter, really in Germany too, they had played enough with me that it all went. Well, in the Eastern, a lot of the people hadn't played his music before. So I would say, okay, everybody just watch. I will do all the dynamics. I will do all the phrase. You watch me, and it'll be great. And I remember the timpanist, who obviously missed that speech of mine about halfway through. He says, Jerry, you're conducting piano and my part says forte. I said, okay, just let me do the speech again.
Right.
But Alan loved it. He embraced it. I mean, all composers don't. Sometimes composers, just play what I wrote. He wanted his music to be interpreted. He cared about the audience, but he also cared about us, the performers.
I think maybe he educated both conductors and musicians on how to do stuff, and as usual, it's the joint effort. You end up with a better product.
Absolutely. So, and I miss him. I really do. Well, it was a very special time that we had together, and I miss Hanako too. She was a remarkable. I mean, every person should have a partner like that, who supports you like that. I mean, it was just extraordinary.
Well, through this project we're doing in his hometown, every day I'm learning new things to admire about Hovhaness, both as a composer, his music, and his life, you know, and his family, whatever. So, so Maestro Schwarz, your contributions to the world of music have been extraordinary, and I particularly appreciate how you've brought more modern American music into the spotlight and given it more respect, more visibility. I encourage everyone who's watching this to immediately go to Maestro Schwarz's excellent website, which is gerardschwarz.com, and I particularly recommend his Behind the Baton series of videos about orchestral repertoires, conducting, and all sorts of other musical topics. Again, that's a rabbit hole I will thankfully be diving into more and more. So thank you again for sharing your insights with us today. I very much appreciate it.
Alan, thank you so much for the wonderful interview and to rekindle all the memories I have of that great composer.
Well, I'm very glad we could do this together. And I hope, I don't know if you're ever going to come to Boston to conduct anything, let me know.
I certainly will.
Okay.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.